digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we are joined once again by Liam from the Rift Group. We have Sanj from Tiger Heart and we have Oscar back from Unity as well. Welcome back, gentlemen.
Hello. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
So very briefly, for the benefit of our listeners who have not heard you previously on one of your sessions with us, would you care to explain a little bit more about who you are and what you do? And I'm going to start with you, Oscar, because in fact you have multiple hats and I only described one of them. Would you care to explain to our listeners a little bit more about what you're up to and who you do things for?
Yes, I'm a literal and metaphorical hat, quite well known for wearing hats at almost every industry games event that you might turn up at. You'll see a guy with a top hat. That'll be me. I work for Unity as an evangelist part-time. I'm also involved in a whole number of things to do with understanding games and game development, in particular working on a project based on the Rocky Horror Show.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Liam, why don't you explain a little bit more about what the Rift Group actually is? Because a lot of people, when you say Rift, they immediately think Oculus Rift rather than Rift Group. Why don't you explain exactly what the Rift Group is?
So Rift Group are a specialist tax house. We deal with all nature of specialist taxes. I deal primarily with the research and development and the video games tax relief taxes. So you'll probably see me at industry events talking about the boring world of tax, but the very important one.
And also investment as well. Fundraising.
Yes, we do have links to financing and such things like that as well. So
wonderful.
All that good stuff.
Okay. And Sanj, why don't you explain a little bit more about what you're doing with Tiger Heart?
So Tiger Heart is my agency. I mean, it's only been around about 3 months, but I've been working in digital since 1998 and been helping businesses engage with consumers in new and exciting ways using technology. I mean, I've seen the cultural shift of human habit and behavior as we all evolve into become this new digital consumer, and some of the successes I have worked with have been burgeoning, groundbreaking, and more importantly, culturally relevant. But I feel we're still in the early stages of this fourth industrial revolution. There are vast amounts of great creative technology and digital ideas that are being conceived, designed, developed, and delivered into the consumer space. Technology now is a part of everything we do, see, and remember. It's exciting, exploratory, and for some of the clients that I work with, very frightening. And basically, I've set up Tiger Heart to help brands believe in new and emerging technologies and to prove that these technologies can be fun, human, and understood.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, gentlemen, now that we have you all on this session, what I wanted to do was talk a little bit more about the impact and the importance culturally of games and technology, because I feel that there is a really interesting shift in the perception of games and the games industry, but also in terms of the way that technology fits into that puzzle. And that's most obviously seen when we look at the impact of the VR industry, which is yet to really find purchase in the mainstream. And yet there's so much excitement, so much vibe around this idea of this new kind of evolution of the games industry and evolution of the technology. So I'm kind of curious to just kind of explore that in a little bit more depth. And I'm going to start with you, Oscar, just to set the scene and the picture, so to speak. Let's talk about the importance and the impact of games in culture, because we have seen a little bit of a demonization of the games industry over the last decade, haven't we, really?
We've always had demonization of the game. So 98 was mentioned. That happens to be when I got into the games industry for the first time. And I was working in a British Telecom at the time with one of the very first online gaming services. And obviously we had a lot of first-person shooters, things like Quake and Counter-Strike. And every time you have anything to do with games, even back in the days when it was Dungeons and Dragons, somebody decides that it's evil, that's the spawn of the devil, and it's corrupting our youth. Obviously, before that it was heavy metal, but the same principle applies. Everyone encountering change comes up with reasons why that frightening thing is wrong and shouldn't be pursued, when actually it holds some really kind of phenomenal kind of future potential. So if you think about kind of that era of dial-up modems and connecting computers for the first time, culturally that impact on our society didn't seem that it was going to be necessarily that huge. We had a few kind of moments of possibility with like crazy films like War Games or whatever else, but generally it was all about how the technology was going to take over the world. Well, it has. But what it's done is it's allowed us to sit with our phones and be able to capture any information at any time, to no longer be bored while sitting on the toilet. There's always things that we can do and reach out to and engage with. But I think that's the really stimulating thing about it, as somebody who's been working on the bleeding edge, is that we've always been kind of like 5-10 years ahead as the games industry, I would argue, because we've been doing all the connectivity because we had a reason to. We've been doing kind of narrative storytelling because we had a reason to. We've been changing the way that you engage with the device, the user experience, the UI, because we've had to. And the opportunity that this ongoing drive of technology has done has taken it from this sort of niche, kind of probably arguably masculine kind of perspective. And now we're in a situation where everybody's grandmother has a smartphone now, more or less, not quite, but nearly.
I'm kind of curious though, because for example, and I know I've said this before in previous shows, but I'm going to kind of go over it again just for the benefit of our listeners. But one of the pieces of research that I find really, really fascinating and interesting is some of the work done by Professor Jane McGonigal. And her theory that she's presented in several TED Talks, and she's worked with all sorts of wonderful labs and done all sorts of really interesting things around serious gaming. And there was a particular piece of research she did where she postulated that if children between the ages of 6 to 16 go through formal education, they go through that period of education for a set amount of hours and a set period of time in their life, because at the end of it, they become a useful member of society, that they've learnt enough to be able to go out there and contribute to society. And her postulation was that if children spend that much amount of time in formal education, they spend at least that amount of time playing games, if not more, of that same period of their life playing games or engaging in games. And so therefore, what exactly is games teaching them? And specifically in her case study, she was looking at MMOs and what was MMOs teaching them. And she came out with lots of research that she did various studies with lots of participants. And her outcomes were looking at things like the fact that MMOs are teaching young people how to become world problem solvers, and that they don't understand the concept of failure because they understand the idea of the epic fail, and they understand the idea that you have a quest, and when that quest team doesn't quite work, you go and you organize that team to get the right set of skills to be able to complete the quest. And
the list of specific skills is huge. I mean, if you look at the improvement in visual acuity, where people who play first-person shooters, it's astounding how much impact playing a first-person shooter has on not just visual acuity, but also visual memory. I've been talking to Fiona Nab, I think it is, at York University, who's doing some work at the moment on memory. And particularly when you apply a distraction between seeing something visually and then responding, finding that thing visually later, the gameplay trains us to be good at this stuff. So there are some really genuine brain training. I mean, not brain training itself, that we've disproved that, but it's fascinating the things that we can do through the way that using kind of physical movement, using the visual display, audio, memory, all these things are incredibly powerful. What we're doing is we're effectively teaching people to be fast decision makers.
Yes. And that was actually one of the outcomes of the piece of research, was that she put together some serious gaming, where one of them, which you might have heard of in the news, was where they put together a kind of a scientific-based game that was trying to solve a particular DNA puzzle or a particular genetics issue. And it was presented to the community, to this hive mind, as a game. And people played the game, and in 3 months they solved the puzzle. And it was then that it was revealed to them that actually it was a genuine medical issue, genuine medical problem that had never been solved by the medical industry. And yet these gamers had come together in the space of 3 months and solved it. And they had actually contributed to medical advancements because they had actually been treating it as a game, treating it as a collaborative community. But
I think a similar thing with cancer research. I believe they did a game that was a bit like kind of playing asteroids, and what you were looking for were these yellow stars effectively inside. What you're actually doing is going through a digitized version of a cancer slide. So effectively, the game players were doing a first pass through this vast amount, too much information, so that then the real, lab technicians could then narrow down more quickly those. I mean, I like I say, I don't remember the full details, but it's amazing what you can do, practical things you can do in that context.
So I'm kind of curious, and the reason I'm bringing this up and talking about the kind of acceptance, if you like, of the true value and impact of what games can bring to the table is because one of the other areas that we see this kind of thing happening an awful lot is in the film industry. And I say this because films are probably one of the most prevalent types of media in terms of the mainstream audience, in terms of the people who think that they're not really into entertainment, but they go and watch a movie still, which is less of a barrier for people to necessarily do than necessarily get involved with gaming, where people perceive that as a bit more of a geeky thing and you've got to have the right hardware or software or whatever that thing is. But what I do find really interesting is in the film industry, there has been a lot of this idea of taking the concepts and principles that are within the game IPs and postulating those and creating science fiction, dystopian fiction, real world kind of based on realistic fact type fiction, all sorts of different sci-fi, if you like, where in fact that they're projecting into their worlds, into their film cinematic worlds, what they believe the future of the world would look like were we to actually have this technology. And some great examples of this kind of thing are things like Minority Report, where we see this really interesting future of the way that technology is being utilized for crime solving. And I'm kind of curious, Sanj, from your perception, you're working very much at the front edge when it comes to what is practically happening in the technology world. And I'm curious from your perspective whether or not you're seeing, that kind of cultural bias of what we're seeing in movies, what we're seeing in games being more and more accepted into the real world of practical application and the way that people perceive technology and are willing to accept ideas about, I'm not going to say gamification because I really hate that word, but the idea of applying game technology or game methodology and thinking to the real world. Are you seeing examples of that kind of emerge in the way that people are applying technology?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Minority Report, which was, a film that came out in 2002 starring, Tom Cruise. And I think, did Steven Spielberg direct it? I'm not sure who directed it. But, that film came out in 2002, but that book was written by, Philip K. Dick back in, I think it was when did he write that book?
A while ago.
Yeah. Well, no, I think, no, it was before the 80s, it was like the 70s. And, like that kind of inspiration has been inspiring people for a long time. And yes, now, there's the Neuromancer quote, by William Gibson, the future is now, it's just not evenly distributed. And that's an interesting thing to think about in our current era because, Tanner, you and I have, been into gaming since the 80s. And we've seen some of the things that are happening now on the screens or on reading books back in the 80s or late 70s. I don't want to give away my age, but my point is whether I see that happening now. Well, it's been happening now for a long time, and it's starting to catch up with everything we do. So much so that I was reading in some tech press at the end of last week that a US company had to shut down a type of artificial intelligence that they created because it started to write its own language and it was starting to communicate with each other.
Indeed.
Outside the human mindset. And that's interesting. One of my friends, he posted that link on his social media and said, "Oh God, it's starting to happen.
Skynet is happening."
Yeah, and I replied straight away saying, well, it's inevitable. It's where technology is evolving to, and we're at an interesting part of human history at the moment where the seismic shift from the human's current state into where we go into, whether that's a VR headset that we wear 24/7 or a USB lead that plugs into our neural synapses. We're on that edge, that tipping point where we slip into this, what I call the digital apex. And it's going to happen, and you and I aren't the people that are going to experience it because we're so used to civilization, how it's been for the last 30, 40 years. However, the new people that are coming into this world, the youngsters, the kids, they're being exposed to these types of useful technologies, these useful habits very early on in their in their ages, and how they grow into this new world that we're all seeing growing around us rapidly is personally I find quite exciting.
Okay.
To answer your question, do I see it happening? Well, it's been happening, and it's just getting faster.
So here's the interesting thing that I'm going to take from what you were just saying there, which is, for those who know me and those who've been to any of the panels where I sit on a panel at a conference or whatever, I always kind of rant about the same things. And I always say this particular phrase, which is, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And so the question I'm going to throw at you, Liam, just because I feel like giving you a really tough question, is is because Sanjay's talking there about how it's kind of already happening. We're seeing this happen already. And for the people who are maybe a little bit more ingrained in their habits, people like us, our generation, we may not be the ones to experience this, yet we are the ones currently designing this for the next generation. And it's that next generation who are going to be kind of lumbered with our assumptions around how this technology should and could work within their lives. And it comes down to this kind of questionable line of, at what point do you draw the line? At what point should there be a moral or ethical question of whether or not that technology should exist and should be part of somebody's life? And I point very specifically to one of the things that Sanjay really touched on very briefly. There was this idea of insertion directly into the brain and, controlling things directly with synapse and nervous system control. Do we think that perhaps there is a little bit too much of a rush to make the technology and exploit the technology because we can be the first ones at that table? And I suppose it goes back to the kind of culture and the attitude of the tech industry as a whole, which is also very similar to the games industry as a whole, which is, let's just get something out there. Let's get the minimum viable product out there and see what happens and experiment and push things along so that we've got this rapid progression. But should there be perhaps more of a pause to think about whether or not some of these technologies should rightly be thrown into the arena in the first place? And I'm curious, Liam, what your thoughts are on this.
I think from seeing some of the tech kind of companies that I come across within my work life, there is most definitely a rush there to try and be the first people to do something. And it's just going to be exactly the same for this type of technology. Do I think on a moral ground it's the right thing to do? Probably not. I feel even at this stage of the technology we have currently, that morally that we probably don't talk to each other as much as we really should, and we look at a screen far too many hours of our lives. So to be plugged into technology constantly and actually physically be plugged into it would be, personally, my thoughts would be a no-no. I think we've kind of lost that human touch and that human kind of interaction. I think Facebook takes over far too much of our lives, and I think once we start getting into that kind of this AI that can obviously do everything for us, it makes us as human beings very lazy and kind of kills the interaction that we may have as human beings. So I think that, like I said, there is too much of a rush for it. I don't think it's the right move, personally.
Okay.
I don't agree. I think we get caught up in a lot of the kind of the storytelling of these issues, and as a result, we kind of over fear the outcome. So let's take the Facebook example. Facebook has great things going for it, but it also has some really kind of deep-seated negative things. The negative things aren't the technology and not the way that we interact with each other. The negatives are how we culturally haven't worked out the social engagement rules that allow us to do that in a healthy way. But it's not like it's a new thing. We've had like issues with trolling on particularly not restricted to Twitter, but particularly places like Twitter and Reddit and various other places. So we know there are places where we have yet to evolve our social norms, and let alone working out how do we enforce our existing rules, our laws in the context of those places. So yes, there is a cultural dynamic that has to be dealt with, but I think actually if you separate out the functions that we're talking about here, in most of the cases we're not talking about hard UI here. We're not talking about AI that actually is making decisions on its own without human intervention in any form. I mean, the obviously the case with DeepMind is extraordinarily interesting, But we're not in a stage where we have to worry about Skynet just yet. Although Demis is probably going to be the guy who creates Skynet. I met him, about a long time ago, and I really like the guy. He's amazing, and I know they really think about this stuff a lot. So I actually think in that context we're in pretty safe hands. But this question about just because we can does that mean we should? I think we actually have to sort of divide that question up a bit. Technically, what is it we're really making? And is it the story that we're getting scared of? Or is it the practicality of it? And quite often it turns out that it's actually the way that we as human beings cope with each other, not the technologies.
It's interesting that you say this, because there is this kind of school of thought that's going around at the moment, wherein the thing you were talking about there, Oscar, is this idea that actually when you put human beings into a social environment whereupon there is no responsibility, no accountability, because essentially social media allows for anonymity, and people can hide behind the digital kind of facade of their social media identity.
Yeah. And there's some evidence that shows that it needs only be perceived anonymity. It doesn't necessarily have to be actual anonymity.
Exactly. And so there is this school of thought where people are saying, actually, we should be creating an environment where, in fact, you have to have real identities, and they are associated to your real world identity, such as your passport, such as your driver's license or your national insurance number, or whatever that thing may be. And within that context, there's no more hiding, and people will be more responsible in these digital and social environments. And there are some experiments that are happening in places like China, for example, which have been kind of referred to, where people are given credits or points that they score based on their interaction within the wider community, in the real and physical sense of how they interact with the physical society. And I'm curious what your thoughts on that are, in terms of, yes, there are a lot of problems that occur, but they do tend to occur because of that perceived anonymity.
Yeah, well, I think it's a bit more complicated than that even, and I'm terribly sorry to say that, but it's cultural context at the end of the day. So again, we're human beings. Human beings have this principle we operate under, social identity theory. We identify those as us and them as them, and there are various criteria for that, whether it's the football team we follow, whether it's the nation that we belong to. Even, unfortunately, we get the really bad effects when it's about the color of our skin or our ethnic background. And these are human ills that affect every situation, whether it's cultural context or not. So what I'm trying to get to with this is, actually, in some circumstances, let's say I'm playing a first-person shooter, part of the identity of us is that we want our aliases, and we want to be bravado, and we want to be abusive to each other, and that's kind of the rules of entry. Now, that's not an inclusive environment. That's a deliberately exclusive environment, and the being rude, what appears on the surface to be bullying, but often isn't, is mostly kind of masculinized bravado, although not necessarily exclusive to men. That is a cultural context thing. I don't want us to stop having those things per se. I think we ought to recognize what that is and understand the context in when that's appropriate. But when that spills out, when people who've been involved in that climate, that echo chamber for a long period of time, spill out into a more public area where they aren't understanding that there's a change of rules, a change of cultural context, and they continue to behave in that way, we have failed to deliver the right information to them, the right education. What we do know is, for example, just by having them have their real first name can make a massive difference to their behavior.
Yes, because again, there's the perception of accountability.
Certainly. Just by having your face image as part of that, an actual face image, even if it's got like funny ears attached to it or some sort of comical animated nose or whatever, those still make you feel like that's you. That's unequivocally, and therefore it's interesting how we see people's behaviour change as a result.
It is. It's very interesting when you talk about this idea of digital identity. And Sandra, I'm going to come back to you on this because A, I know you've read the book, and B, I think you've got something to say about it. I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on this idea of digital identity and the evolution of digital identity in the context of Ready Player One. And I'm throwing this out there because I'm reasonably confident you have read the book. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I'm not going to answer that question, just in case someone from Warner Brothers is listening. But, with regards to digital identity, So I think there are two steps here.
Yes.
The first step is when it comes to digital identity, people, generally speaking, like to escape into other worlds, whether it's through film, whether it's through books, whether it's through social media, whatever it is, people generally like to do that. Now, the first step, the digital realm allows people to do that. It allows people to go somewhere and think about things that are alien to them, their current surroundings. So that's the first step. The second step, and this is something that I think is going to take probably a couple of decades for the human mind to understand, is the digital realm is a different realm to the physical realm. And what I mean by that is when someone goes online, whether they, place themselves under an alias or place themselves as who their identity is, who they think they are, is a question that's quite hard to understand. Now, I know I touched on the whole Neuralink thing, and I think the film and the book Ready Player One kind of touches on this kind of notion of you can be anyone, you can do whatever you want, and it can be whatever you want it to be. That's what the digital realm offers us. Now, there are problems with that because, people can be quite rude and people can be quite nasty, and some horrible things have happened where people commit suicide, or some really not dangerous things have happened because of the output of a scenario within the digital realm. However, we are starting to move into a future where code and data are the new commerce. And what I mean by that is people are building things, and they're building things that are outside of the standard imagination of what you have within the physical world. When I say the standard imagination, I'm not just talking about I live in a house, but I want to live in a tower block. This is a kind of mindset where it's going to be, I live in a house, but you know what? When I go into the physical world, I'm going to have 15 arms, and my brain is going to have 4 different aspects to it that compute a billion different things each. And each one of those things are things that I'm going to be thinking about 1 million times per second, every hour. It's the kind of potential within the digital realm is baffling. And where AI fits in that is that digital realm allows AI to be sporadic, to be infinitized, to be all encompassing and beyond. And a good example of that is, I don't know if you've seen the film Her.
Yep.
A good example of that is how that character, when I say the character, the female AI assistant, Samantha, how she is communicating with thousands of people in a split second. And that's where that kind of shift into what I was talking about before, the digital apex, that's where things are going to change, for humans habitually. And I think it's going to happen very rapidly, and it's going to frighten a lot of people. But the problem, I guess the problems we have at the moment is that the human mind can't really fathom how to apply themselves within that space. And that needs to change. And I think where it needs to start is with, and I know it's going to sound really silly, is with parenting.
No, I think that this is very logical, because everything starts in the home. It starts with what young children are being exposed to. But I want to pick up on what you were saying there about Her, because there's some interesting facets there. And the first one that I'm really kind of fascinated by is this idea that actually in the context of the film Her, there is this idea that, first of all, it's not just that she's speaking to hundreds of thousands of people all at the same time, it's that she's actually engaged in a relationship with them all at the same time. And that was the piece that kind of really horrified Joaquin Phoenix's kind of character, is when he realized actually she's having this relationship, this intimacy with
on him.
Yeah, essentially that's the way he felt. And yet from her perspective, this isn't about cheating, this is about facilitating and nurturing these relationships with each and every person, because they're all as important and all as valid as the next. And that was a really interesting kind of moment of like the human mind versus the AI mind not quite understanding the full scope and the capability of an AI mind to not really see itself being restricted in these ways. But the other thing that I found really interesting about this movie, and I, when I talk about this movie with people, I often find that the one thing that they don't talk about is the fact that the subtlety of the way that it's been depicted in this movie in terms of everyday life and the technology and the integration of technology in everyday life. Enough so that what the main character, Joaquin Phoenix's character, does for a living is actually quite unusual when you think about what he does for a living. He writes letters for people. He writes, greeting cards and special birthday letters or love letters or whatever the thing may be. That's what he does. He composes letters for people, because in the technology and technological age that they're living in the cultural age they're living in, that degree of intimacy has been lost, and they need other people to help and facilitate. It's become a service because people have forgotten how to do that thing. And if I were to ask around, the group here, when was the last time you physically wrote pen on paper an actual letter and posted it probably would have been quite a long time ago.
Many years.
And so I find that really interesting, that idea that it was such a subtle shift in the perception of what constitutes normal working life. And the reason I'm saying this is because one of the things I keep on hearing a lot about at the moment, and there's some people who are on one side of the fence and some people who are on the other, and it's all around how AI will impact people's living, people's work, and especially in the autonomous or automotive sector of all these jobs that will be lost for lorry drivers and truckers and all these logistics companies that are, shifting millions of tons of things across the countries. And those drivers, they're going to lose their job because there will be autonomous vehicles that will do this thing more efficiently than they could. And there's a lot of people who are just, that there's all these stories that you see about, the amount of jobs that will be lost because of AI and the amount of blue collars and white collars that will be lost because of AI. And yet there is not this focus particularly on, well, okay then, fair enough. There's going to be a bunch of people who may lose their jobs. But doesn't this free us up for something more interesting? Doesn't this free us up for an evolution of the way that we look at the working life and what work and productivity entails? And I'm curious, Liam, whether or not you have any thoughts or views on what exactly is it that we should be thinking about, rather than the negative of, all these people who are going to lose their job or lose their income, to actually what are the opportunities? What blue sky is this opening up? What would be your kind of initial thoughts on this? Because I'm sure that you kind of speak to a lot of people in the context of your day-to-day who are looking at the blue sky opportunities of where they see a gap and an opportunity and an opening.
I do, but I do feel on both sides of that. I used to be a blue-collar worker myself, so I can understand the kind of implications that would have on people, and going back to something very briefly what Oscar was obviously discussing, where people, it's more of the human side of it, where people kind of identify themselves as that. So that's maybe where the fear comes from. They identify themselves as a tracker, so they change what they do. They have to change who they are. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's from that side of things. But there's going to have to be people out there that operate in these machines in some way. There's going to be job openings as well as closings. Mm-hmm. It's just the way that obviously business is. The more and more we rely on AI, the more and more that AI is going to break down, and there's going to be more opportunity for people to be out there, to be in employment within these sectors, to be in the tech sector. So maybe that's the answer. Maybe it's going to be much more geared towards that, but there'll be more employment off the back of it.
I think this is interesting because another kind of similarity to this would be the film Hidden Figures, which was talking about the real story of people of colour, women of colour who've facilitated and participated in the history of NASA. And one of the interesting pieces of that was the IBM machine. I don't know who's watched this movie and saw the movie, but so there was this introduction of this IBM machine, and the non people of color were kind of like, oh well, that's a bit below us. It's a machine. We don't really need to worry about how that thing works. Whereas the supervisor of the colored computing section was like, actually, I think I'm going to learn a little bit about this machine. I'm going to figure out how this thing works. And then in the end, it was very much a case of, well, everybody else is being made obsolete now. We don't need you to physically compute, because this IBM computer can do more calculations than you can do in a day, can do in a second. And she was the one who kind of was like, well, actually, I've learned how to program the thing. I've learned how to, insert the things it needs and do what it needs to do. And nobody else in the building knew how to do that. And suddenly she became this very important person in terms of the facilitation of the IBM machine. And she made a point of making sure that all of her team knew how to do that thing. And so they became this hugely relevant workforce. Whereas the other people who thought themselves a little bit too above it all ended up becoming slightly more obsolete. And I'm kind of curious whether or not we think that perhaps there is that danger again with technology and with the evolution of where we're going, not just with AI, but with other types of technology as well, whether that's blockchain, cryptocurrency, or whatever the thing may be, whether or not there is perhaps a certain attitude from traditional industry of being, well, it's the new tech culture thing, it's whatever they're doing, but we don't really need to get our fingers dirty with that. If it happens, it happens. But right now we're happy doing what we do. Do you think that there is this danger that they're going to become obsolete, that they're going to end up realizing a little bit too late down the line that actually this thing is going to be taking over from where they were?
Already happening. Most definitely with cryptocurrency and the big banks.
Oh, yes.
Huge. Yes, I've heard it time and time again from people within cryptocurrency and blockchain. The banks are so far behind it, it is actually terrifying. So it's already happening. It really is. They're stuck in the dark ages.
Oh, particularly if you think about it, we're actually still running a check clearing system.
Yeah.
We may have an electronic kind of overlay on it, but essentially our banking system is still basically check clearing. Whereas obviously the whole kind of bit currency is living in the digital, being in the, follow that blockchain. It just feels to me like we're going back to, I think it's like the early 1800s or the, late 1700s, Captain Ludd, probably fictional character that was behind a manifesto that famously creates this army of Luddites. I mean, the thing is, we often misunderstand that whole era. It's not that people were against technology; it's just there was no support for the teams, of people who were being displaced. So people who had come in and implemented the technology had no consequence. The people who were working on the previous technology had no opportunity. And that caused, a whole bunch of really serious issues, social issues. And this, to me, is the problem. We just haven't got a sense of trust. We're in the arguably Thatcher's Britain of no society. At least the way we tend to treat people in employment is in that way. And actually, if you look at places like, Newcastle, in particular, we've still got families with who've been unemployed since the steel work, since the ship work.
The coal industry went down. Yeah.
And if you think about that, that's the crime here, that actually we're not paying attention to what we need. And I don't mean this in a kind of angsty kind of lefty way, although I am an angsty lefty. I mean it in the sense of actually the opportunity lost here is the problem I'm worried about. There's this fantastic technology coming along. We can do amazing things with it. We need to understand where the people who are currently employed in areas that are going to become no longer viable, how we then transition them to something that is viable, not just because we want to make sure those people have skills, which of course we do, but also because we want to make sure we have customers. And if they're unemployed, they can't be customers.
It's interesting you say this, though, because although some of our listeners who are not from the UK may not know where Newcastle is or how far outside of the core cities we're talking here in terms of the north of England, I think this is actually really, really relevant for America and the kind of rural America and areas of America that had traditionally relied on very tangible industries such as mining, such as trucking or whatever the thing may be. And in fact, there's a lot of these industries that are dying out. And I think that's been a cause of a lot of issues within the US and certainly, in other parts of the world as well. But I am kind of curious, as a last word, just to understand from each of you, what you think is that significant thing that needs to happen, be it a cultural thing or a technological thing, that's just going to push us to the next step. What do you think is going to be that thing that's just going to shift the balance of the way that we as humanity, not as specific societies, but as humanity, are thinking about the world around us? And I am going to throw this rather large, big question, first of all, at you, Liam.
Robot servants. honestly.
Robot monkey butlers, surely.
Exactly. Perfect, Oscar. Absolutely perfect. No, I don't know. How would you answer it? In a gaming sense or in just a general technology sense?
In whatever way you feel is best.
For gaming, for me, I suppose we are starting to be taken a little bit more seriously within the games industry, not only as a country, but as a whole kind of industry. I just think it needs to be taken to that next step where people above us really realize that it's not a toy anymore. It's actually something that is very tangible and is a storytelling device, as well as a kind of, like we were saying about how skills are set through video games. I play an awful lot of online MMOs and such things like that. I've been able to learn leadership, hand-eye coordination, things like that, skills that I would not really get from many other places possibly, but I've been able to do that with my friends and actually enjoy and have stories to tell afterwards. It's something that's so much more engaging than just sitting down and moving a character around a screen. It actually builds a lot more upon it. And I think once it's taken more seriously, we'll start getting the recognition that it actually deserves.
It's interesting that you say that about recognition, because I think a lot of people forget that the games industry actually is, more of a financial contributor to this country than potentially other creative arts. And I'm saying that with inverted fingers and in the broadest possible sense, because I don't want to offend anybody else.
And I know I've talked a lot, but I want to chuck something in on that particular score.
Yeah.
So this is an area where some county councils, in particular the one where I live, Rushmore Borough Council, are absolutely seeing games as a way of re-energizing an area. So Aldershot's one of those peculiar areas where it's not the most expensive. It's very much
it's a military town.
Yeah, it's an ex-military town. I say ex, it is the home of the British Army, but a lot of the army has moved down. So this is an odd town which has lost a lot of its kind of infrastructure. And what they're doing is they're going to try and build, hopefully, fingers crossed, to build a games hub in Aldershot. And the reason for doing that is manifold. But if you can encourage, developers, highly skilled developers into a town, that's fantastic anyway. But actually, if you can also use it as a way of building, outreach into the community to give people a sense of this is a place where this thing happens. You don't need to have huge amounts of infrastructure. You don't have, much in the way of kind of like housing and all that. That's just normal stuff. There's nothing particularly special needed. But it encourages people to understand not only just the need for technical education, but also arts education and the ability to combine all of the STEAM, so science, technology, engineering, arts, and maths in one endeavor doesn't just help us make games. It helps encourage all sorts of people doing amazing things at the same time as delivering entertainment value, and an industry that's still delivering more revenue to the country than film and music combined.
Okay. So, Oscar, what's your view in terms of the significant thing that needs to happen? Or are you in agreement with Liam?
I think fundamentally for me, it's about we need to look at the industry as an industry and give it the credence that it has. And the VGTR, video games tax... I can never remember what it says, what the acronym stands for. But tax relief, that's it, really. That has been an amazing thing. I know for my own game, we wouldn't have been able to get to where we are if that didn't exist. So, without that tax relief, you cannot put the same level of investment. It makes the ability for small games companies to actually be able to put something out there and hope to be successful.
Okay. So, Sanj, in a non-gaming sector response, what's your thoughts in terms of what needs to shift? What's going to be that big change?
I think it's just an open mind. There is a kind of, I don't know, there's a little bit of a space race at the moment with technology, particularly in the sector that I work in, and everyone's kind of obsessed with looking for the next best thing, and they're looking at it, well, they're trying to utilize it in a short-term manner, when reality, these things that are being built and designed and being taken into, the public space need to be, there's responsibility in that investment, and people need to think about what they can do with it in the short term, but also think about how it can last within the long term.
I think you're very right there in terms of people rushing to kind of get to the finishing post and not really thinking long-term picture. But gentlemen, I want to thank you all for joining us this week. And as usual, we like to ask you to share with us your social media handle of choice so that our listeners can find out a little bit more about what you're up to and maybe follow you. And if you would like to share with us what your social media handles are, Oscar.
So I have a complicated Twitter handle. So it's Athanasius, which is at ATHANATEUS.
And that's on Twitter. Yes?
It is, yes.
Wonderful. Liam, what about your good self?
So I have two, which is one of them is they're both Twitter. One of them is at RiftBDM, and the other one is at GamingTax.
Wonderful, thank you. And Sanj?
Yeah, you can get me both on Twitter and Instagram on Sanj Surati, which is SanjSurati, or on the Tiger Heart one, which is Tiger Heart Tech, which is TigerHeartTech.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us and thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thinking of starting your own podcast? Why not speak to the GL Pro UK team? They handle all of our podcasting service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk. digitaljamsessions.com